Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 89 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here today with Jerry to continue our Big Idea Summer Series. So we have an interesting topic today that I'm really excited to talk to you about, Jerry, of hypocrisy. So maybe not something initially you think about the trauma-informed movement, but I have some thoughts on this. And if you're new to the podcast, we're exploring some light summer fun. We're using John Haidt's book, The Happiness Hypothesis, and going through chapter and chapter as he compares big philosophical, spiritual ideas to modern science. So if you haven't read the book, it's a really good one. If you haven't read it, we'll go and catch you up so you won't miss anything. So keep listening. So as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And Jerry, I'll let you start this week. What are you thinking about this week?
I got two things. And one is my niece had a baby. And so
congratulations.
The beauty of creation, we're going up to visit her for the 4th. Her and her husband, they live up in Red Feather Lake. So we'll go spend a little time with her to celebrate such a special occasion. She's the baby in the family. So as the baby has a baby, that means I'm getting older. So that's that. And then maybe on a little sadder note, I had, just to kind of shout out, I have a very long time friend whose husband just passed away. And 41 years she's been married and dealing with grief. And so I want to send out my condolences to her. But I also want to take a moment to recognize that adversity is not trauma. Mm-hmm. And that we all have to deal with loss or pain in our lives, but it doesn't have to be traumatizing. So when the people around you reach out to kind of support you, most of the time what they kind of talk about is it becomes tolerable stress as opposed to toxic stress.
Yeah.
And I think that gets confusing sometimes when we talk about adversity as trauma.
Yeah.
And so it's really important at this time to kind of recognize that she has a lot of support, and hopefully this is a tolerable stress. Not a traumatizing stress. So that's my two bright, shiny objects. One is the fact that I have known her for over 50 years and stayed connected. So
that's
really
awesome.
Important.
Very cool. So mine has a little bit to do with our topic today of hypocrisy. And really, it started out with me.
Is this a confession or this?
Yeah, well, it's more of a self-accountability measure. Is when I started to do self-care trainings, probably about 10 years ago, I really realized very quick that if I'm going to stand up in front of a group of people and tell them to do something, that I needed to do it too. And so from that point, I sort of started this journey of really researching a lot around wellness and how to keep yourself healthy just in general. Because if you're not healthy in general, I think the stress of our work environment is going to have a greater impact on you. So I always, and it's kind of been fun because a lot of times trauma steals wellness away from people. So I like self-care trainings are kind of fun because things that are good for us are also can be beneficial to those we work with as well. But two things that I've been doing to kind of testing out is contrast showers and intermittent fasting. And I'll just throw out there, I am not a medical professional. So if you're going to look into these things yourself, don't take my advice. Go talk to somebody that knows something about this professionally. But, both of these things, and if you're not familiar with the terms, intermittent fasting there's two ways to kind of do it. One is to have 16 hours before your last caloric intake and your first one of the next day. So there's that kind of big stretch. And the other way is to go 5 days eating regular and then 2 days where there's 24 hours of only consuming 500 to 600 calories. And I've kind of put those two together because I had I traveled a lot in June, and I was surrounded by a lot of good food. So the other one's contrast showers, where you, after you take your normal shower on a warmer temperature, you get as hot as you can stand, then you go as cold as you can stand, as hot as you can stand, as cold as you can stand. So you basically do 3 colds in there and you end on a cold. And both of these are designed to really push your body into a survival state in some ways, and not like a fight or flight intense thing, but both the sensation of hunger, even though I'll admit the intermittent fasting, you're hungry, but you're not starving by any stretch. I think we use that word way too quickly. And contrast showers is just kind of, you get goosebumps all over. But there's been some interesting research that, and you're kind of talking about adversity, and obviously this is in no way, shape, or form the adversity you were talking about. But when we kind of stress our body in those ways, it actually kind of triggers this part of our nervous system, helps heart rate variability, and actually has a lot of good proven things for wellness and long life. So I just think it's interesting that we've hit such a level, or at least some of us are lucky enough to reach such a level of privilege that now we're trying to, in some ways, put strain on our body to trigger these healthy responses. And I think it's fascinating research. But also, I was just taking my contrast shower before I jumped on with you, and I'm like, man, how lucky am I to live a life where I'm trying to inflict a little bit of pain so that I trigger this part of my biology that usually lays pretty dormant. So I just think it's fascinating where we're going with some of this research. But yeah. So we'll get away from my shower that I just took and talk about this topic. So hypocrisy. I think one of the things that I've not talked to you about, Jerry, and one of the studies that Haidt talks about, that I've loved for years, is this study on averages, and how any survey of pretty much, well, not any group, because the Japanese seem to be more realistic than most any other population on this stuff. But if you ask people how good looking they are, how intelligent they are, how well they are in bed, you ask them all these questions, and most of the time they'll say they're above average. In fact, I think he said 80 to 90% of people think they're above average, which just statistically speaking is ridiculous. So this isn't part necessarily of the trauma-informed piece of our conversation, but I just love these studies that show we all think we're so much better than we really are. And I know, Jerry, you and I are much better looking and much more intelligent than the average person, but I just think it's funny other people have this delusion that they're just better than everybody else.
I never got asked those questions in a study. I probably would have had not so much the average answer to those kinds of things, right? But my thought about that is that we see what we want to see in the world, right? And so, in a way, what would it serve us survival-wise to say we're dumber, we're uglier, we're right? How is that adaptive? Right? And kind of looking at that. So, in a way, I think that there's some coping piece to that as well, to kind of looking at that. And I also wonder sometimes between what we say publicly and what we feel internally.
Yeah.
Right? And so, those kinds of studies, I think are kind of interesting to kind of think about really what do people believe? How do you get to what they truly believe underneath about themselves?
Yeah.
That's not been my experience of people coming into my therapy office is that they feel better than everybody else.
Right. Exactly.
Although I have had some. But most of them are struggling with feeling like they belong. They're damaged. They're somehow not good enough. So I think that those people weren't included in that study.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think, I just find it hilarious that we all pretty much think we're better than everybody else. But, and this kind of does resonate with the trauma piece a lot more to me. And I wouldn't necessarily, I'll use the word hypocrisy, but I think I wouldn't use this necessarily in the clinical term. But one of the things that we really see, especially in motivational interviewing, is we use the word discrepancies more than hypocrisy because that has such a negative tone. It makes a great chapter heading, but I think in the work we do, I think discrepancies is a much better way. But we really, in the MI research, see a very powerful thing happen when I realize that the life I'm living is not aligned with my values or the rules that I want to live by. And in MI, we have a term for that realization and the accompanied stress of cognitive dissonance. And so while this chapter talks a lot about, hypocrisy from that way, one of the things that I really see that I think we miss in our field a lot is I think a lot of folks in survival mode never get a chance to kind of reflect on what are the rules that I live by? Well, what values drive my behavior? And one of the things that in motivational interviewing that I really challenge people in my trainings to think about is, asking some of those questions. I think I know there's a ton of research out there on the power of values and how when we think about our values, we're healthier, we're more resilient. People have done work around a moral compass and thinking about values. And I find them as such a key thing to help people build resiliency, sort of shift some of that negative mindset about self-relationships in the world. And so, I think while the word hypocrisy is not something I think about very much in my clinical approaches and trainings, I do think that idea of discrepancies and helping people find and reflect on that differentiation between behaviors and values does come in under the trauma-informed lens in a more clinical and applicable way, I believe. And I just kind of wonder, in your thinking, how do you help people, especially in your trauma work, do the thoughts about values and core ideals and those things, do they play a role in your thinking and how you kind of help people build that resiliency and start to develop a different sense of self than the shame and the self-doubt that trauma often leaves people with?
Certainly that's an important part of the work, right? In terms of that. And so many of the clients that I've worked with don't feel like they chose the things that are in their lives. Mm-hmm. The things that were imposed on them or happened to them or the circumstances that they're in to kind of do it. And so this issue of choice and empowerment is a very foreign concept to them. That it really, even as you talk about motivational interviewing and you talk about is how do you get somebody to feel this sense that they have choice in the world? Yeah. That they can choose to live by these values or choose to live by these values, as opposed to this is just the way the world is. Yeah. And so I think that helping my clients realize that they have choice, that that they sometimes take responsibility for things that wasn't their fault.
Mm-hmm.
That things didn't happen to them because of who they are, right? They didn't get sexually abused because they're bad, or their parents didn't leave them because they're bad. Their parents left them because their parents were struggling with their own problems, not because of them. And I think that that's a really difficult place to get your clients to reflect on those questions of, well, if I have choice, what are the choices I want to make?
Yeah.
And what are the rules that I want to live by?
Yeah.
So I do think it's a part of the process, but it's a developmental step in the process as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've really come to appreciate it. And I want to speak to the reality that a lot of times, especially folks struggling with poverty, you don't have all the choices that someone with a lot of resources has. So there's a reality there, but you always, I think a lot of times people in the helping professions, we're so invested in getting them from point A to point B that we do a lot of that work without showing them where their choices are. I mean, one of the things, that I challenge my audience to when they're in their communication is, your clients have the option to stay the same. That they may not. They can just keep doing what they're doing, and that's a choice that they can make. Now, there might be consequences to that choice, but that is a legitimate choice. And I one of the things that always has stuck with me through MI since I first learned it is something called that menu of options, where always, because if we give two choices or throw out two options, we're going to give the right and the wrong one. So, there's always kind of the stay the same option. There's maybe the choice we would ideally want them to make, but also giving them, and it helps keep us set, is a third choice as well. And I think anytime we can show people that they do have some power in their situations, we give them that sense of control, which I think a lot of times when you're in that survival mode, and again, what trauma does to how you see the world is that control is sort of a fleeting thing. And I think that's important to show that as part of, again, kind of taking back control of your life. Such an important piece to that equation.
Language is important. So one of the things is, I don't feel like I give them choices. Mm-hmm. I don't even feel like I'm there to change them.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm there to really get to know them,
mm-hmm.
to be with them, so that they're not alone in their experience.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the things in this book that I think gets missed quite a bit, is he talks about mindfulness, he talks about cognitive behavioral therapy, he talks about medication,
mm-hmm.
but he doesn't really talk about connection.
Yeah.
And that really my experience in whatever therapy, whatever approach you have, it's really because you feel that in that moment, you're truly connected with somebody.
Yeah.
That creates the change. That people hold your ambivalence. People, if you're using motivation, if you're doing cognitive, people hold your thoughts, kind of look at them. But that really, when you can feel in some ways co-regulated,
mm-hmm.
Connected, that you feel like you belong to something and you're accepted, that I think that's really where empowerment comes from.
Mm-hmm.
That I empower you to have your experience.
Yeah.
And so I think therapy in a way gets this thing where you come in and I fix you.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to really you have the ability internally to fix whatever you need to fix. I just need to kind of get to know it. And as I get to know it, you get to know it.
Yeah.
To kind of looking at that piece. So I think that, one of the things that I think is really came out of this chapter for me was how we look in the world to find experiences to validate our beliefs.
Yep.
Right? And you think about that for us, but then you think about that for a trauma victim.
Yeah.
You think about that in terms of how many places you could look and find things that are dangerous. If you're looking for danger, how much you can look for places that you're being rejected. If you want to look for that, right? You can that we interpret, when you talk to people about politics, it's interesting how they only find the things about that validate their beliefs about things.
Yep.
And it's like, I look at them and go, I can't believe you believe that. Don't you know about this other thing over here that only I look at? I don't look at what you look at, right? That's why it's so important to come together to really listen to each other, because we all look at different facets of the same thing, not the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I just, as I was reading this chapter, I'm so lucky, I think, to have gotten into the neurobiology, because there's a few people that I think would consider themselves true experts on the brain, but I'm just like blown away by humility. Like maybe I will understand the right amygdala at some point. And like everything I learn about the brain, I realize how little I actually know. And so I think that, I was just lucky to end up in psychology at this point. And I think with some of the shared, the kids, the families we worked with, to be just so humbled by, trying to help people and, a lot of times feeling like, hey, I'm not sure what to do. I'm not sure, I need to, and again, relationship I could always fall back on, but, I think my humility of my lack of understanding of so many things really helps me I love being wrong. And I didn't realize, kind of this chapter made me appreciate that. Like, I love that when new research comes out, the challenges, kind of my understanding, it makes me change slides. I think I celebrate that, but I think a lot of times, we can get stuck. I think you go the political side, I think it's easy to get pretty stuck in that. But that was something I took out of this chapter, is how lucky I was to.
Neuroscientists, even neuroscientists, the smartest neuroscientists, really only, even in studying the amygdala, they don't study the whole amygdala. They study a function. Or people fall in love with the autonomic nervous system, or they fall in love with the hippocampus, and they study, the prefrontal cortex. So, really what it does is it says I'm going to explain it by looking at this component of the brain.
Yeah.
No one really holds the whole brain because it's too complex and overwhelming to really think about how it is. So I think as you read different people, they're just looking at a different facet of what it is, and based on their perception, this other thing doesn't explain it, right? And so I think that as you read, you begin to integrate different, and that's why I read so many different approaches to dealing with trauma in therapy, because I want to have as many lenses to understand my client as I possibly can. So I want to understand what cognitive behavioral therapy thinks about this. I want to understand what affective neuroscience says about this. I want to understand what social neuroscience says about this. I want to understand what the autonomic, polyvagal theory says about this. It all just tells you a piece, but if I can hold different lenses, then I can in some ways bring different tools to my client to help them to. It doesn't mean I hold the whole truth. No.
And I think that's humbling, right? One of the things I really struggle, and I still do to some extent, is, and I love that it's got a name now called imposter syndrome. Because when I first started doing these trainings, I felt, who am I to talk about the freaking brain? And, I was just a guy that read maybe 2 more books than the people I was training at the time. But it's like, I always kind of thought, well, what if a scientist wanders into my training? And that really kept me up nights early on. And again, I'm still to this day humbled by the complexity of human nature. And I think the problems we take on, like trying to end homelessness, keeps you grounded because, is that going to happen in my lifetime? I don't know. I mean, I hope it does, at least chronic homelessness, but I might die someday and the problem might get worse. And I think, when you confront the mountains that we confront, they can be overwhelming, but at least I found at least they've kept me fairly grounded. And I think it keeps me from that grandiose sort of thinking that he mentions a lot in this chapter, which I have it in other areas, of course. But this is professionally, I'm more, why are people listening to me than anything else?
I'm as I read this, I had a conversation. It was somewhat political, but I won't get into that part. But I had a conversation with this young man. He's in his 30s. He's in business. He's very conservative, Republican kind of, and that's not important. What's important is I knew him and his family as he grew up, right? So I know a little bit about him. But his perception on this issue is, why do we have to give other people help? Because I made it all by myself and I got to where I was, right? And so here's this guy that lived in a really nice house that his parents worked hard for.
Yeah.
He had access to lots of activities after school that he went to. He went to a school that basically provided him with all sorts of opportunities, right? He had friends that were there to support him, but his view of the world is he made it all by himself, right? It's like, there's no way that I could argue with him that somehow somebody else deserves something for us to help him because they don't have anybody helping him.
Yeah.
He's like, nobody helped me. I made it all by myself. It's like, what in the world? How did you come to this conclusion? Right? You had so many people in your life supporting you.
Yeah.
But yet his belief is he's worked hard. He went to college. He got here and he did it all on his own. Nobody gave him a job. It's like, so when you think about these concepts in this chapter, is how people organize their perceptions. Mm-hmm. And really, in some ways, their cognitions drive their beliefs about the world.
Yeah.
Right? And so you talk about unconscious bias, or you talk about it's not even unconscious bias. It's almost like dissociative experiences that somehow you forget all the people that, and I'm here, you're this guy, that immigrant that came across the country with just your clothes on your back. And that's not who you are, buddy. But in some ways, when I listen to that and then I hear this chapter, I can listen to him and think about, so his elephant, right? The narrative he created kind of makes him feel better. He makes him feel better than other people.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the next thing I want to spend most of the time, because one of the things that I find hypocrisy incredibly frustrating, like the gentleman you mentioned there. But I mean, I feel like, and I see this in our own system. So I'd like to start there before we talk about even outside people. Is like there's this frustrating as all get out thing about people that have gone on disability, and we want everybody to work, right? And yet we've set up disability. Since I've been in the profession, this has been a problem where if you go get a part-time job, like somebody who hasn't worked for 10, 15 years, so doesn't have a lot of confidence to get back in the workplace, probably if they started working full-time, that'd be tough for them. So if they were looked to get back in the field to work maybe a minimum wage job or a part-time job, they would actually lose their disability, and there's like financial incentives for them really not to go back into the workplace. And so I remember when we were at the residential treatment center and you hired me as a quality person, I was going to these state meetings, and one of the state meetings for successful outcomes for kids in residential treatment was whether or not we got them out of treatment in 6 months. Not whether they progressed in treatment, but whether we discharged them in 6 months. There were no like anything else besides that. So we would have been the most successful thing in the world if we kept them to 5 months and 30 days and discharged them no matter what then. And so part of this, I think it's really easy to see the hypocrisy of them when we're the us. But I also step back and I look at the systems that we're in and like, are we really here to help people? And I hate to ask that question because I think most people that I meet, the vast majority of people in our professions really come from a great place. But I look at some of our systems and they scare me. And so I just see so much of this in our own work where we're not kind of regulated or able to step outside and say, what are we really doing here? Why are we building another shelter, right? And again, I'd rather somebody have a shelter than sleeping out, but a shelter is no way to live a better life. I mean, why don't we help build affordable housing where we can get people really stabilized so they can live a better life? And there's just all these things in our own profession that just scream hypocrisy to me. And I'm, I don't know. It's hard on the days where I'm feeling a little worn down to keep my positive outlook.
Matt, when you're creating large systems, it's very hard to create them with the capacity to respond to the individual. Mm-hmm. Right? And so, for example, you use this issue of disability. Yeah. There's all these people that are benefiting from disability. Mm-hmm. There's these people who are disabled but have some capacity to work. Mm-hmm. And then there's these people who take advantage of disability. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, it could be that there's a small percentage of people taking advantage of disability, mm-hmm. but we're going to write rules to make sure that those people don't, so those rules cover everybody who's got to do it, right? And so you look at the people who are suffering and saying, why isn't the system? The person writing the rules looks at the 6 people who took right, and writes rules that says, I'm giving you 6 months because you're taking advantage of it. Yes, yeah. Well, there really are 6 people taking advantage of it.
Yeah.
But there's 1 million people benefiting from it. But we'll write rules to protect, right? So I think large systems, by the very nature of them, objectify people.
Yeah.
And that when you're in there, it's very hard for you, when you're dealing with an individual, to come to terms with what the system tends to do. And I think that that's a natural tendency, which is why we shouldn't really have systems take care of these people. Communities should. Mm-hmm. Right? Is that when, up until really the Great Depression, the government had very little investment in taking care of any people of them. Mm-hmm. It was our communities that did it. But when there was a Great Depression, more of those kinds of functions got moved over to government. And government should fund communities so communities could do this kind of stuff. Mm. It should, rather than I'm going to monitor everyone in your community, is how do I figure out how to give this community some resources so they could best meet their needs? And that's a much better model for me. As we looked at our community outreach program, It was much better for us to go to the community and ask them, what are you already doing that we could help you do better? Mm-hmm. As opposed to me, who has very little understanding of that community, to come up with some wise idea of, I'll just build a treatment center, right? It's like, no, I should go there and find out who's tutoring people in the community and figure out how I could support them doing those things. Mm-hmm. Or who's getting a little basketball team together in the community right? So I think that our model of large systems meeting the needs of individuals is by very nature never really going to work well.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, and it's like, I struggle because on one hand, I totally agree with you, and on the other hand, it's like I worry about if you live in certain communities, you're not getting crap, and that's like the whole thing. I think the interesting thing with the recent Democratic debate was the whole state rights versus federal when it was talking about busing is, and I'd love to get your thought on this, following up what you just said, is if we left it to certain states, I mean, and we can pick on the South, but the North has their own history with this as well, is, hey, if you left it to Alabama, would schools still be totally segregated? And you could argue that they're still segregated in Alabama. But I wonder how you balance that, is looking at that I think I would agree with you to a great extent, but also where is there in your thinking a point where, a higher level of accountability maybe to say, no, this is not right for any citizen within our country. So in your thinking, how do you distinguish between, communities having the power versus some sort of maybe higher oversight, which is never perfect either? But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, since it's like it's in the news.
So my thought about that, and I don't really have a good answer. If I did, I'd run for office, but I can't.
Yeah.
I don't want to. But my thought about that is that when I took my little small system that I ran, mm-hmm. And if I could clearly outline what I think needed to happen, and then give my staff the opportunity to figure out, it wasn't an option whether we had to figure out how to, say, for example, economically do this more efficiently.
Yeah.
You have to do this, and we have to come in with these parameters. Mm-hmm. However, the better solution came when my staff figured it out and gave it to me.
Yeah.
Right? So I think in this model, the largest system has to set the parameters. Everybody has an equal right to education. Everybody has an equal right to health care. Everybody has equal right to life. And I hold you accountable. However, you have to figure out a solution and then present it how you met that demand. It's like when I come in and you just can't have Washington know what, Bend, Oregon needs, and also Oklahoma City needs, and right? It's just too large. But we can set and say these kind of large parameters, and we will hold you accountable to those things, mm-hmm. Right? So I think what we tend to get is black and white thinking of either the federal government does this or the state does it.
Yeah.
So, for example, I was coming from in Canada, and I was on the plane, and I was with a vice president of an oil company up there in Canada, and I asked him what his thoughts were about fracking. What do you know about that? Because that's something that impacts us here in Colorado, right? To kind of do it. And he said there's a lot of benefits, but there's a lot of risk. So that your government should minimize the risks and your company should maximize the benefits, right? And that you have to have that balance. And the same thing goes, say, for agriculture. There's a lot of risks in how you plant and how you grow, and the government has to monitor that, but the farmers have to kind of figure out. And so everything is about balance. It isn't about this way or this way. And so many of these arguments get polarized that this is the right way or this, and really it's a yin and yang. They both have to exist.
Yeah.
And that's how I think this concept of understanding that you hold only one piece of the solution because you only hold one perspective. And this person, how do we come together, listen deeply to each other, use the knowledge we both have to come up with a more innovative, creative. But that's not what we have going on because we have a lot of trauma in our country.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I'll be honest pisses me off sometimes is how
Take a cold shower, would you?
I know. I always have to be the regulated one, Jerry. I don't always want to be the Why doesn't somebody want to hear my opinion, right? Why doesn't somebody take the time to learn about me, right? I do this as almost a hobby, and part of my job is I reach out to people I don't understand because I want to understand them. But I just wish somebody else would be the regulated one for a second. But let me throw out, and I'll throw out the political risk here. But one of the things that has been a real challenge to me, and honestly, something I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out is one of the, and this has just been a frustration. So I've reached out to people that believe differently and think differently and vote differently than I do to try to find common ground. And and this a lot has to do with people of faith, and most of the people I reach out to are from the evangelical Christian faith on this, because I feel like we share similar values. If you would say what does, and I'm lucky enough to have a great brother-in-law as an evangelical preacher, so I got hardcore folks to talk to about this, and we have great discussions. And what just frustrates the hell out of me is I believe we share similar values because, as I always say, JC told you to do it, right? These are New Testament quotes. This isn't me like being all socially aware and liberal. This is like Jesus telling you to do this stuff. And so I don't throw them out, but I want to sometimes. They're in my back pocket if they're last resort. But what frustrates me is things around like hunger, food scarcity, housing and healthcare as human rights, criminal justice reform, things again that are in the sacred books, that we're all supposed to be doing this together. I try, because I'm not trying to get you to vote differently. I'm trying to get you to help me take, for example, homelessness out of the political divide. We can share difference on abortions, guns, whatever it might be, but some of these, it seems like we should be able to work together. And yet, I mean, to be honest with you, I have great discussions. I understand differently, but to try to get people to can we both call together? Can we, it's just like, I think to get people to act differently is something that I've really struggled with. So, I'd like to think about hypocrisy, at least our perceived hypocrisy of others, which is something we got to be very careful of. But how do we help create an us with folks, Jerry? How do we help people that we should naturally be on the same team working in homelessness or poverty or abuse, or have good schools in all communities? Do you have any thoughts on how we bridge some of this divide?
I think
you got 15 minutes for this, so take the rest of the time to give me your answer.
I just think that, Matt, these issues have been with us throughout history, and that there's always been, once we became an agricultural society where some people grow things and some people buy things that people grow, there's people who have power and there's people who don't. There's people who have way more than they need, and there's people that don't have enough that they need. These are issues that have gone on for eternity, right? And the issue really is that we've got to create an environment where we can have these kinds of discussions about these issues, and that there has to be, in some ways, how do you when we're talking about trauma treatment, how do I take care of my own needs and protect my own self-care and my own self and take care of people? Right? Even in that, there's this issue, is that I could go take care of you so much that I hurt myself. Right? And I get sick and my immune system gets up, but you're getting taken care of. Or I can take care of myself and not take care of you. Or we could figure out a way to do both. And I think that that's the hard place to get to, where it's not an either or. And that this issue with is that when we're safe as a species, we could socially engage. Mm-hmm. But when we're not feeling safe, we get defensive and we get protective, and we see the world through a lens of, this is my stuff and you're going to take it from me, right? And so the question not of why is there homelessness, why are so many people feeling unsafe? Yeah. And I think it goes back to, why are we so disconnected from each other? Right? What is it about our culture and about the world today that creates such separation? Right? And how do we bridge the disconnectedness? Right? And so I believe when we feel connected to each other, then we feel like, oh, you're hungry, I got food. But when we're disconnected, I see you as you're the enemy, and I got to hold on and protect my family. It's like, so that is the issue for me. More of is, are we getting more and more disconnected from each other, even though we have more cell phones, more ways to connect to do it? Is that we're not as connected, right? We feel more alone, and when we're alone, these issues are going to be not solved. Yeah. Right? So I think that it's not about abortions. It's not about guns. It's not about immigration. It's about connection. Yeah. Right? And that and that's why in this book, I keep thinking he doesn't mention relational connectedness. Mm-hmm. And to me I know that when people come to me for trauma work, or people are coming to me because they're in pain, the best thing I could really offer them is some sense of connectedness. Yeah. Right? And so these issues will always be with us in our history. Mm-hmm. But when we feel connected, right, it's like, or do we feel like those people on the other side of that border are our enemies and we want to kind of go over there and take what they have? So that to me is this hypocrisy. Mm-hmm. That in one side he's talking about happiness, mm-hmm. and yet we're talking about this defensive place that we live in, that we continue to find ways to validate our own view and discount other, that we're better than everybody else, that how does that equate to happiness?
Yeah. Yeah, that we're all above average.
Except the people out there that look different than us, that dress different.
The thought that came in my head, and this is a impractical thought. This has, I don't know how to use this, but it's like, as a community, and I'm thinking about Denver, Colorado here. And obviously it's not everybody, including myself. I wouldn't be part of the them or the us here, but it's like, but we can all get together, 60,000 of us in a stadium of totally different political beliefs, and y'all crazy Bronco fans are like brothers and sisters with each other, right? So they're like, and we're in the midst of the World's Cup. Well, I guess we're in a political divide about our women's World Cup team, but I'll take that one out, the bad example. But like we come together as communities, whether it's around like sports teams, we come together around trash. I mean, there are still these pockets. I think the problem when we get on our phones is we get reinforced to our biases. But it's like we're still capable of it. I think some of my frustration is like it's hard to trap people in a Broncos game and do some team building activities with them and talk about ending homelessness. But yeah, it's like we're still capable of it, but it's like we gather around relatively in some way meaningless things like watching people play a game.
So I'll give you a story about distorted perception of self.
Yes.
So I'm growing up, and in my neighborhood, we played football in the street.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a group of these guys that we could beat anybody in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right? They'd come, we'd be much better. So we got to the belief that we're so good, we should go and join a semi-pro league. Well, we paid money. We put our money together and joined this league. We had to drive out to Long Island to Hofstra University, and we played in this league. And this league was made up of football players who didn't make the NFL, but they stayed together and they created these teams, right? So they were like 300 pounds. And so we went out there and we thought we were going to take this league. Well, we paid our money. And we had our first game, and at the end of the first half, it was 52-0 them. They came, and they gave our money back and said, would you be willing to go home if we give you your money back? So the reality of our distorted sense of self got crushed by the universe.
Yeah.
So there's a good example that sometimes this average, we've run into something in the world that challenges that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a good narcissistic injury.
Yeah.
Brings back to reality, right? To kind of looking at that. But in a way, we, in our little place, we became way bigger than we were.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that sometimes people, when they see the world from their own little corner of the world, they have a distortion of what's out there and who they are.
Yeah.
And sometimes when they run into things that what we might call traumatizing, that football game for us was really a really good lesson for us.
Yeah.
Right? We're not as good. You know what? I better find a different profession than professional football to go play. Yeah. Right? I'm not big enough, strong enough, or fast enough. Yep. It's like, this is not probably where I'm going to make a living at doing that. Yep. That wasn't a bad thing. No. So I think that sometimes when there's a discrepancy between who we think we are and who the world is, but sometimes crazy things happen. So this little guy becomes a surgeon, and all of a sudden he thinks he's this great guy, and everybody in the world starts telling him he's great and kind of do it. And his narcissism gets fed. Yeah. It's not good for that guy, but his profession is to do it. And so sometimes I think in our culture, we have a lot of these little guys that get a lot of big money and and they end up thinking they're bigger than they are. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they don't feel responsible to help anybody because they got there by themselves. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, yeah. And I did this on my. When the reality is that that's not true, but it is true for them. Yeah. Well, they need something in the world to run them over 52-0 and yes. Tell them, no, that's not the way the world really is. Right? Yeah.
And my one piece of continued hope, and I hope this stays with me for the rest of my life, is that unlike when I started my career 20 years ago, when I was just doing this work because I cared about kids, right? I cared about families. I was something inside me made me want to give to folks. We talked about that in the last episode. But the one hope that I do have in all this hypocrisy is that we have science to teach people to if we use it in the right way, if we throw it in their face, we're going to get defensiveness back. But I find it really powerful to talk about the science of trauma, because I think a lot of times Well, I know we haven't had the understanding to walk by someone experiencing homelessness on the street and have empathy for that person, because our theory of mind says, okay, what would I do if I was that person? Well, I get up my ass and go get a job. Well, you've got a resume, you've got self-confidence, you've got a history of success, you've got a lot of things that would allow you to think that way. And my hope is that doing what you're doing what I'm doing what our audience is doing, that when we get trauma literate, that we can spread this to our churches. We can spread this to our policymakers in a way that's not going to change the world 3-4 years from now. But again, I take the long view of, well, what does 10 years look like? What does 20 years look like? And it doesn't mean that if we integrate this into our thinking that everything goes away and all our problems are solved. But damn it, if we can just understand each other and have some compassion. And I think that if science can help us build compassion and we present it and not you're wrong, but hey, I was wrong about this 20 years ago. Here's what I learned. Is there any way we can work together with this understanding? I still have hope there. And yeah, that's my implicit bias that I will not let go no matter what. So any last thoughts? I've loved this discussion, Jerry.
I guess we have a lot of science at this global warming too, but that's so.
Wow, Jerry, thanks for smashing my optimism.
What I'm leaving with is that you have to have hope in spite of sometimes what's happening in the world.
Yeah.
Right? Is that if you're looking for the world to only validate your hope, and that's why you have it, we're all doomed. We'll burn out. We're doomed. Is that what you really have to look at is, just as I said, I didn't go to my job taking care of children because I wanted them to get better. I went there because I got better every day. Yeah. Every day I showed up for them and they did it. I felt like a better person that day. And when I felt like a better person, lo and behold, and they looked in my eyes and saw that I enjoyed being with them, they got better. Yeah. So I think when we show up, in spite of some of the things that we see out in the world, that's where your hope is good for, right? Yeah. Throughout history, there's always been the yin and the yang. And there always will be. But we can't stop because there's a opposite side that's kind of balancing that.
Yeah.
Right? That we always have to kind of show up. So I think by doing this kind of fun book not that it's fun, because I think he's very depressing over but I do think it's important that we spend time talking about this and showing up for the people that we kind of work with. They depend on us to believe in them that things could be better.
Well,
and if we stop believing, imagine what they're going to start feeling.
And to not give up our own power as well. I mean, I think you probably have the same experience in schools where, the teacher will come up to you after a training and say, love the training. I've got 3 kids throwing chairs at me each day. What do I do about that? There's only one of me and 25 of them. I'm like, you need to call your policymakers and organize your union to advocate for change, because it's going to be nearly impossible to regulate 25 kids when 3 of them are throwing chairs at you each and every day. Now, there are some skills, and that's a little flippant way of how I answer that question, but it's like we've got to, when's the last time we've called? I want other people to call, so it challenges us to make sure we don't lose our advocacy and that always working to help for our communities to make it a little bit better tomorrow than it was yesterday. So great way to end on a chapter about hypocrisy. So this from 2 guys who are much above average on intelligence and looks. So better husbands, athletic. You played semi-pro football.
Yeah, for a half, not even a half. 52-0 at the half, right?
I love that story. Well, as always, we want to thank you for joining us. I want to end on a bright, shiny object as well. My wife and I are celebrating an anniversary this week. So I want to say happy anniversary to Sarah. Thanks to our listeners. We'll be back next week to tackle another big idea.
So my thing is, we should change it to the 4th of July to Happy Interdependence Day.
There we go.
Right?
There we go.
Because we don't do this alone.
Absolutely. And as always, you can find show notes, discussion questions, and everything else on traumainformedlens.org. Thank you, everybody, and happy 4th. And, I guess by the time this comes out, I hope everybody had a happy 4th. And we'll talk to you next week. Thanks so much.